when I saw, successive leadership difficulties, the danger of the party falling apart. And I began to think that I could do better than this.
Malcolm Fraser dominated Liberal politics for a decade through the force of his personality. His coming to power set off divisions which would shadow his achievements. Fraser won 3 elections, but by the mid-80s had been disowned by the Liberal establishment.
I therefore take total responsibility for the defeat of the government.
Only now is he being reassessed. In the early 70s, old values were being turned on their head. Australians were confronted with change from all directions. Anything seemed possible, and in December 1972, the old order in Canberra was overthrown. Gough Whitlam exploited the national mood, and the once great Liberal Party had lost its way.
When we went into opposition in 1972, it was pretty hard to find sensible Liberals who didn't say, well, it's time, and we can sort of understand that the community's opted for change. And after all, Whitlam was a very attractive alternative at the beginning.
You put in opposition to get rid of the government. You're not put there to get extra staff and get more motor cars and overseas trips, bigger salaries. I mean, that's there's a very good argument for not paying opposition members of parliament anything, so they'll work a bit harder to get into government.
Billy Snedden was chosen as the new leader. And less than a year after losing government, the Liberals were planning to use Labor's first budget to engineer their own return.
I wrote a memo to Snedden in about October 1973, in which I said it'd be quite stupid to vote against the budget, just to vote against it on our own with our other allies voting for it. It's going to pass, it's a futile exercise. But what we ought to think about was trying to force an election next April, May, when the half-Senate election was due, to see if we could force the House of Representatives to go out with us.
On the 18th of May, we Australians will take part in an historic expression of the will of the people. There is to be an election for both houses of the National Parliament.
Good evening. I welcome this opportunity to speak to you because we are beset by difficult and worrying problems.
The Liberals had threatened to block supply. Gough Whitlam called their bluff and won the election.
But the win for the Labor Party has been a very small one.
The 1974 election loss soon put Billy Snedden under threat.
We went and said, Bill, if you haven't got the message, it's time you did get the message. He said, well, I have made some mistakes. And we said, well, this is getting promising, at least if he realises he's made some mistakes. And we said, well, what are they? He said, well, I haven't had some of you fellas in for enough drinks.
Many of us, and in particular many backbenchers in the House of Representatives, believed that there was a man who had emerged with great potential to lead Australia through the very difficult days which face us.
Malcolm Fraser had been 19 years in the Parliament. He was Army and Defence Minister during the Vietnam War, climaxing in his bitter resignation and attack on John Gorton. It would take 2 challengers to beat Billy Snedden. By the eve of the second challenge, Malcolm Fraser had levelled his sights already on Gough Whitlam.
Well, one of the things, if I was leader, that I would certainly not want to do is to give the Prime Minister, Mr. Whitlam, any indication when an election might occur. I'd want to keep that knowledge buttoned up and catch him one day with his pants well and truly down.
Well, the tone under Malcolm Fraser was one of a great deal more seriousness, more determined, a greater appreciation of the toughness that would be required to win an election.
Governments never won elections because they got nothing to win and everything to lose. And therefore, an opposition's prime duty is to force elections if it can.
Senator Withers, the leader of the opposition in the Senate.
The opposition continued to needle the government.
Mr Deputy President, we had the Prime Minister open here today giving us one of his lectures on how democracy is so frail in Australia at the moment. And he and his party are the people who are putting democracy under attack in this country, not the Senate, not the Senate.
We'd just sit back and laugh. It was lovely to make them upset from the opposition benches. And I think one of the faults of the opposition in the last 10 years, and I know one shouldn't make comment, but I don't think they've learnt how to annoy the government enough. And once you start annoying people, they make bad decisions. There's a slip of the tongue. They make remarks they shouldn't make, and that's the way you capitalise on the weaknesses of a government.
The incompetence, the damage, the failures of the worst government in history can't be ignored.
The Whitlam government was put under assault. A procession of resignations and scandals.
Never really recovered.
And finally, the loans affair, the unauthorised attempt to borrow billions of dollars abroad. Minerals and Energy Minister Rex Connor was forced from office.
The opposition now has no choice. We will use the power vested in us by the Constitution and delay the passage of the government's money bills through the Senate until the Parliament goes to the people.
We decided on it. We took it into our shadow cabinet. They agreed, without dissent from memory. We took it in the party room, and we got agreement there. And then after that, it was just a matter of on with the dance.
But the Liberal Party, unlike Labor, had a tradition of allowing members to cross the floor on matters of conscience. In the Senate, a small dissident group of Liberals was led by the late Senator Alan Missen.
He really objected to it on two main grounds. One was that he thought what was happening at the time certainly did not represent reprehensible circumstances.
It is a matter over which the opposition did a great deal of worrying.
So he was very, very opposed to that. In the second place, he felt that an opposition which did this sort of thing would always be tarnished, would be in some way impaired by the fact that, in the eyes of many, it had come to office in some peculiarly, almost nefarious way.
If some people didn't have the guts to go on and wanted to cross the floor and chicken out, we would. It could be on their head. And they would bear the mark. Tell you this, they'd have been expelled the next day from the Liberal Party.
One prominent Liberal who'd already left the party was the former Prime Minister, John Gorton. No friend of Malcolm Fraser, he opposed the blocking of supply.
It's a terrible proposition, this, and it goes far beyond the present circumstances. The whole of the future of this country is tied up in this terrible thing that they've done.
I remember having done a Gallup poll of my own around South Australia, in the country and in the metropolitan area. I spoke on the phone to people who were pretty responsible and very astute politically, and only one out of about 30 agreed that we were doing the right thing.
Well, Malcolm Fraser very simply had to deal with a constant stream of weak-kneed Liberal politicians, many of whom populated the Senate at the time, who felt that a compromise ought to be made, that it was too dangerous to tough it out.
Many of the people around him, including me, formed the view that he was very, very ambivalent about whether he wished to go ahead with it, but kept on being perhaps steeled. And I do also vividly recall a number of occasions passing by his office, and the impression that one gained, you'd see him standing with his back against the wall or leaning against the desk, and he was very, very tense and very, very concerned, and he had the look of a man who felt as though he was under enormous personal stress.
Well, I was certainly concerned about the situation that Australia was in, but once the decision was made, I wasn't canvassing counter-arguments and reasons, mechanisms that could be used to pull out.
Good thing I had a shave.
However, in early November, there was a crisis meeting of federal and state coalition leaders in Melbourne. Some at that meeting say Malcolm Fraser did speak of pulling out.
I was late getting to the meeting because of the time I received the notice and the time it took to fly to Melbourne. And when I walked into the room, I noticed there were people starting to get up and moving around the room. And Malcolm said, "Joe, I'm sorry, we couldn't wait. We've just had moved a motion and they are now preparing the wording of that motion which will be released as a consequence of this meeting." And he said there are two of the senators, as I recall it, who weren't prepared to stick any longer in blocking supply. They had a problem. And so the meeting evidently had decided, I gathered from what he said, that it was time for them to back off.
Oh, that is an absolute arrant nonsense. The only press release that we were issued was a press release saying that the issue has to be resolved, but certainly there was no suggestion of a back down.
Have you got all the gadgets going?
Well, I can well remember Joe and Tom Lewis. Charles Court wasn't there, but he was on the phone. They exploded at any mere suggestion that we might back off. I mean, fair enough. Why should they take that attitude? It wasn't their head on the guillotine. I mean, it was just Malcolm's head and my head. So, you can be a great urger at that stage.
I can remember this as clear as if it was yesterday. I said, well, if you're going to put out a motion like that and agree to that situation, can't you see, all of you, and I spoke very loudly and firmly, can't you see across the nation the headlines, Fraser capitulates? And once you get that sort of a headline, then you can go home and forget about politics. Nobody will trust you anymore. You see it out to the bitter end.
Joe's memory is totally defective.
A meeting of, you're right? A meeting of federal and state Liberal and National Country Party leaders in Melbourne today agreed unanimously that the federal opposition should maintain its current stand, designed to give the people the opportunity to pass judgment on the Whitlam government.
There was a motto in the office, a wrong decision forcefully pursued is much better than no decision at all. And I think that was conveyed to a lot of the Liberal senators, and as it turned out, they held together until November 11. Whether they would have held any longer than that is a very, very debatable point. My personal view is another 24 hours and the bills would have been passed.
Malcolm Fraser held his nerve. In the game of brinkmanship, attention shifted to the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, the man appointed by Gough Whitlam. What would he do? And did he communicate his intentions to Malcolm Fraser?
Fraser, can you tell us anything about your meeting with the Governor-General?
No, I couldn't on other occasions, and I can't on this occasion.
Is your stand still firm about blocking supply?
Of course it is.
I accepted back in 1973 that it would basically end up in the sacking by the Governor-General.
Malcolm reported back on conversations he had with the Governor-General, and while it's true that at an early stage he'd indicated that Sir John Kerr had suggested that a possibility was the sacking of the government, it wasn't one which either Malcolm or we rated as the probable outcome, at least initially.
There might have been a theoretical discussion saying these are the options available, but John Kerr never for 1 minute gave me an indication of what was in his mind and what he was going to do, and I wouldn't have expected him to.
One of the things about Sir John Kerr that astonished a lot of us in the sort of world of those days was that he would wear a black top hat. He'd come a long way from his origins, and my view is that Whitlam psychologically misunderstood him. And I think we had a better understanding of the psychology of John Kerr, someone who had come so far and would therefore, as Governor-General, wish to do the right thing.
I said to him, as a matter of fact, Sir John, if there's an election, you're going to be condemned by Mr. Whitlam and the Labour Party for doing the right thing. But if there is not an election, we're going to have to say something about the failure of the office of the Governor-General to uphold the Constitution.
Never seen you fellas up so early. You seriously expect Mr. Whitlam to give ground on this today?
Well, we'll find out, won't we?
On the morning of November the 11th, John Kerr did what Malcolm Fraser was demanding. Gough Whitlam was sacked, and the leader of the opposition commissioned to form a caretaker government.
I can remember the Governor-General saying that he didn't think it appropriate to have the customary glass of champagne on this occasion. I'm sure he was right in that.
I went down to the front of Parliament House and the car arrived, the solitary figure of Malcolm Fraser in the car. He got out. I walked up, took him by the hand and said, "Welcome, Prime Minister." He smiled slightly and said, "Tony, let's get the Shadow Cabinet together quickly." We assembled the Shadow Cabinet. He walked in, there was still great tension, great anxiety, and he just sort of kept them on tenterhooks for a few minutes. He just sort of stood there and chatted, and I think it was Doug Anthony said, "Well, Malcolm, what happened? You know, where do we stand?" And he just smiled again slightly and said, "Doug, you're Deputy Prime Minister, and Reg, move quickly."
All I wanted was the double dissolution. I got that. That's my only reward. I don't ache for recognition. I don't ache for a place in history. I don't ache for a brass plaque on the wall. Maybe a big statue out here for pigeons to sit on or something like that, but nah, I mean, that's...
Now that Mr. Fraser is caretaker, what does this actually involve? Does it mean he's got to keep the lawns and that mowed around Parliament? Or what?
Popular dissent in the wake of Whitlam's dismissal tested the nerve of the caretaker Prime Minister.
When Mr. Fraser took the microphone, he was shouted down by a group of hecklers crowded close to the dais.
The campaign began in Tasmania with a rally at Hobart Place, and I was standing down amongst the crowd next to Senator Jack Marriott, and he grabbed a placard and brought it down over the fellow's head, and the rally erupted into brawling. The police waded in. It was an absolute shambles, and Fraser was appalled. Fraser, like every other politician, was a man who wanted to be loved, and he had just seen the people that he sought to lead fighting amongst each other because of him. And that night, he seriously contemplated pulling out. He contemplated resignation.
I did. That's a nonsense. An absolute nonsense. Somebody else might have spoken about it, but I certainly would not have. That would be handing the country over to the thugs that at the time were supporting the Labour Party.
He's a very sensitive, considerate, compassionate man, most of which is disguised by his demeanour. But I think I do think that he was quite shaken by the extent of antagonism.
It seemed that Australian society had been polarised by the sacking of the Labour government. But for Liberals, Malcolm Fraser was a hero, his actions vindicated by a sweeping victory at the polls.
When we came in, it was a very traumatic time, the dismissal of the government, and it had unquestionably, in my mind, others can disagree, but in my mind, the dismissal of the Whitlam government had an indelible impression on Malcolm Fraser, quite apart from him becoming Prime Minister, in terms of his future action. And he was troubled at how to bring society together again.
Malcolm had that sense of anxiety that in the minds of some people that he, Malcolm Fraser, was not acknowledged and accepted as being Prime Minister. That was a very a companion, but he didn't greatly welcome that anxiety, and I think he showed that. I felt it.
If any minister believed that what had happened in 1975, resulting in a massive majority in both houses of Parliament, put a restraint on the government in terms of what it might do, then that's not a view that they ever expressed to me.
The Fraser victory was a triumph for the Liberal Party. But did the manner of his coming to power give people the wrong idea of what kind of leader Malcolm Fraser would be?
What was expected of Fraser was to roll events back. Nobody thought that anything more would come of this than once we had a return of stable government, we would have a stable economy.
The statement which I made to the National Parliament tonight represents a major step in the implementation of government economic policy.
In their first economic statement in May 1976, the government cut $2.5 billion from government spending. At the same time, the Liberals gave generously to Australian families. A non-means-tested allowance was to be paid to every family with children.
At that point, we started to include social reforms such as the family allowance system, at the expense of having a tight and lean expenditure budget.
We were never going to be a government just for the dollars and cents alone. The bottom line alone was not going to be the government's value.
I was a little surprised that the 1976 economic statement didn't go a bit further in cutting government spending. My view of the early Fraser years is that he ran a good government in his first 4 or 5 years, although the 1977 budget, which was Phillip Lynch's second budget, was needlessly generous.
People felt that we had cut hard enough, far enough. And if you look at the editorials following the budgets introduced in those early years, they were generally saying we've gone too far, been too harsh.
Good evening. And now for something completely different. Welcome to Countdown.
Australia, tonight you're going to see Bob Welch, Mark Hodder, and our proudest export, the Little River Band.
Malcolm Fraser was to be Prime Minister for 7 years and 4 months. It was a time of frequent conflict with the unions and the left, who never forgave Fraser for 1975. Yet he was responsible for securing radical social reforms in the face of Conservative opposition.
I think Malcolm Fraser was a Tory patrician. He had the very best instincts of a Conservative, determined to do things for people. Now, he did them for different reasons from me. I'm involved in empowering people and bringing people on. He might do them out of a sense of noblesse oblige, but he did them nevertheless.
He established the Kakadu National Park, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. He put through the legislation which has given Aboriginals in the Northern Territory half the territory's land area. None of this translated into votes for the Fraser government. The left were not prepared to give him any support for whatever the government did that was part of their agenda. So you have to say that all of this was political altruism on Fraser's part.
The refugees had been in heavy seas for 22 days, and in that time, many of them had not eaten. 19 of the refugees are children under the age of 5. You speak English? Do you? What happened to you?
We came from Vietnam.
It's a very real honour to be able to welcome you as new citizens to Australia, and I wish you all the best for your future lives in this country, yourselves and your children, and I hope that in Australia your best hopes and aspirations for the future will be realised.
Multiculturalism was meant to give expression to the view in government policy that you could be a good Australian and still love your country of origin. You didn't have to behave like somebody who's white, Anglo-Saxon and Protestant to be a good Australian. That would have been the view before 1939, but it was certainly not an appropriate view in the 1970s.
In the 1970s, the fight against apartheid intensified in South Africa. The rights of black Africans were championed by Malcolm Fraser in the face of conservatives within the party.
I can remember very clearly a very fiery party meeting shortly after we came into government, when a series of backbenchers, particularly in the Senate, stood up and abused Fraser for wanting to close down the voice of the white Rhodesians in Sydney, and also for in any way wanting to interfere with South Africa. And he got a very rough time on that, but he was very vehement.
Fraser prevailed through the force of his personality and his stamina.
Malcolm Fraser is an immensely hard-working man. He was a man who drove himself and a man who drove others.
It's been nothing unusual to have 3 or 4 cabinet meetings a day, meeting early in the morning. On one occasion at 7 o'clock, I arranged for the girls in the dining room to, in the most ostentatious way possible, to make the point, to bring in to me bacon and eggs, tea and toast, and plonk it on the cabinet table. And he said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, I have to eat even if you haven't."
If there was the slightest suggestion that somebody wasn't doing the right thing, Malcolm would pounce on them.
Malcolm Fraser loved a crisis. I've often said to people that he'd never read that passage in the Book of Common Prayer that said we should be quietly governed.
Sheer single-mindedness gave Malcolm Fraser his policy victories, but some of his colleagues also felt its force.
In the way in which the party is now being led and managed, I just feel I couldn't continue in it.
Don Chipp, the experienced former minister, quit the party after being left out of Fraser's first ministry.
For the first time in many years, I feel very found, as if I'm going places in new directions with the help of a lot of friends.
Chipp went on to create the Australian Democrats, a party to the left of the Liberals.
An enormous number of voters who vote Australian Democrats were formerly swinging voters, who were capable of being swung over to vote Liberal by policies that were regarded as policies of social justice. Now, in latter years, the Liberal Party seems to me to have neglected the social justice part of its challenge and has lost those swinging voters back again to either the Democrats. I would go almost as far to say that the formation of the Democrats has denied the Liberal Party government on more than one occasion.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to inform the House that the government has recommended to His Excellency the Governor-General that the House of Representatives be dissolved on the 10th of November next, and that a general election for members of the House of Representatives be held on Saturday, the 10th of December.
Malcolm Fraser's next ministerial crisis coincided with the 1977 election. It involved the Treasurer, Phillip Lynch, one of Fraser's inner circle during the events of 1975. Accusations were emerging that Lynch had improperly used his position to profit from land dealings.
Before I went to the Governor-General to recommend an election on that occasion, I was coming back with Phillip on a VIP plane. He knew I was leaving the plane to go to Government House. He was preoccupied, and he knew then that the issue was going to break. his personal issue. I was allowed to go out to Government House in total ignorance of that fact.
As the crisis deepened, Phillip Lynch was admitted to hospital with a serious illness.
Do you feel this will have any effect on your party's image in the electorate, Prime Minister?
Is your government now on the defensive as the Labour government was in 1975?
Oh, good heavens, sir. Good heavens, Prime Minister, I repeat that question. Do you feel that these reports have damaged your party's standing in the electorate at this time?
No.
Do you still have faith in Mr. Lynch? If there are no questions on any other subject, are there any questions on any other subject?
We started off in Melbourne, fighting our way through a rugby scrum of reporters and television cameras, flew to Sydney for a function at the Hilton Hotel, and there was another rugby scrum demanding answers about Phillip Lynch, who was sick in hospital. We would have lost that election, and there was only one way to handle that situation, and that was for Phillip Lynch to go, and he was too ill in hospital to reach a rational decision himself. And the decision was made for him by his colleagues at a meeting that evening in the Commonwealth offices in Martin Place.
Why did Mr. Lynch have to resign?
He believed it best and said so in his letter to me that otherwise the election he felt would be fought on the circumstances of his own affairs, and he wanted the election to be fought on the issue, the vital, important economic issues that are before the people of Australia, and I believe that he was right.
Malcolm Fraser never visited Phillip Lynch in hospital during the whole of that crisis.
I thought to do that to a man in his sickbed, I thought that was unforgivable, absolutely unforgivable. Sort of thing you wouldn't do in the lower deck. Maybe you do it at the Graziers Club, but you don't do it amongst real people. Never. Never. And I thought that after that, the Fraser government was shot. They never realised it. But I thought the Fraser government killed itself after 2 years. Because what it showed was that hard work and loyalty counted for nothing. Not a thing if it was to save somebody else's hide.
There are two kinds of loyalty, unfortunately, and the Prime Minister or the head of a government has to be the arbiter between those two kinds of loyalty. Loyalty to colleagues, loyalty to a person, and that's very important. But there's also the question of loyalty to values, loyalty to a code of behaviour.
Lynch would later be exonerated. The big beneficiary was a junior minister, John Howard, elevated by Fraser straight to the Treasury.
I hope one of the elements in it was ability, but I wouldn't claim that it was all due to that. I think there is an element of, fortuitous circumstances in it as well.
He's halved inflation.
Well, he's kept his word.
And cut taxation.
That's helped us.
We've halved inflation. Now we're ready to go with $6,000 million worth of development.
Malcolm Fraser was returned to government with his huge majority almost intact.
For several hours now, thousands upon thousands of people have been lining the streets of Melbourne to pay their last silent tribute to a giant of Australian politics and public life.
And as they leave the steps and head across Russell Street in Melbourne, the pallbearers beside them. Parliamentarians, relatives, friends to the late Sir Robert Menzies.
The founder of the Liberal Party and symbol of simpler and stable times was finally gone. By August of 1978, Menzies' successors were again enveloped in crisis. Once again, it involved one of Malcolm Fraser's closest and trusted allies from the 1975 crisis.
I accept without reservation that the Prime Minister has the right to hire and fire.
Senator Reg Withers had been investigated by a Royal Commission for attempting to change the name of an electorate. Withers refused to resign and was sacked by Fraser.
Well, it certainly wasn't smart to dump Withers. That was just a ludicrous, an appalling thing to do. I mean, it outraged me, and the way in which it was done was divisive. I mean, I'm trying not to bring up too many bad things here, but I mean, you know, most of the cabinet met at Kirribilli and discussed that, and then I think Margaret Guilfoyle, Jim Killen and I came up the next day unaware that they'd had a sort of an informal cabinet discussion the night before, and we were handed the report and told to endorse the sacking of Withers. Well, I recall being so outraged I threw the report away. It hit an orange juice jug and smashed everywhere. I mean, it was hardly edifying conduct, but I was outraged at this, and I asked for a break and a call-off so we could actually read the report that was given to us before we could discuss it. So we had a break for, I don't know, say an hour, and I read this report and became even more convinced that Withers should not be going.
I know that all Senator Withers' colleagues who were discussing these matters yesterday felt a very real sense of regret and of sadness at what had happened and, in a sense, maybe at what had to happen. But unanimously, ministers felt that there was no other decision that could be reached.
I mean, what had Withers done? Come on. I mean, he'd picked up a telephone and told the commissioner they shouldn't call the seat of the Gold Coast, it should be called Macpherson. And he was to be sacked for this? His entire record of public service was to be dispensed with on the trash can because he'd suggested the change in a name? I mean, well, this was just ludicrous. I mean, sometimes Malcolm had such a fetish with being seen to be doing something proper, it didn't matter that he acted improperly to achieve what he thought was proper.
After I was sacked, they said, how do you feel about it? And I said, well, you know, I most certainly should never have come into Parliament because I spent 4 years of my life in the Navy. And all the time I was at sea, I was never frightened, really. Oh, I was a bit scared when you think you're going to get your head shot off, but you're really not that frightened because I always knew that if some disaster struck, the captain would save me before he'd save himself. And he would go down with his ship, the last, but he'd make certain I was saved. I said, whereas in politics, what happens is the captain's the first day of the side and takes all the lifebelts.
It's very easy not to have any concern about failures. You stick with your mates no matter what they do. I'm just not made that way, I'm afraid.
News is that the Liberal Country Party coalition has been returned, but with the majority sharply reduced.
As the Liberals won their third straight election, new economic ideas were taking root on the other side of the world.
But the main thing is that I think that we do keep links between heads of government.
Fraser had been seen as a soulmate of Margaret Thatcher, but he was uncomfortable with the free market ideology emerging from Thatcher's Britain.
Australia's a long way away in terms of miles from some of these events.
One person in the Fraser ministry was becoming attracted by these ideas. The Treasurer, John Howard.
After the 1980 election was the beginning of my differences with Malcolm. My biggest disappointment was his backing away from the introduction of a broad-based indirect tax. In the 1980 election campaign, I had an understanding with him and Doug Anthony that none of us would rule out the introduction of a broad-based indirect tax if we were re-elected, because I knew and many people knew that that reform was necessary.
John Howard had been influenced by his economic advisor at the time, Dr. John Hewson.
When the people of Australia have so emphatically turned their backs on a broad-based tax as they did in March of 1993, I'm not sure why John Howard wants to show a great deal of interest in being able to pursue it 10 years earlier or 11 or 12 years earlier. It was clearly very bad politics.
The political dynamics of the time were very simply that the Liberal Party had a quite unprecedented mandate from the people to go down a reformist, economic rationalist path.
If the charge is that we did not perform the way economic rationalists in the 1980s claimed they wanted to perform, then I'll plead very, very guilty to that. I wouldn't want to do what economic rationalists wanted to do, because I think their views were extreme. It was an accountant's view, and very often a false view and a very cruel view.
Malcolm Fraser and John Howard began to take opposing sides in economic debate.
Malcolm Fraser at heart was a regulator. He didn't trust or like banks very much. He has all his political career been an avowed opponent of floating exchange rates.
Australian banking is in a state of upheaval. With the growth of building societies, credit unions and cash management trusts, banks are being forced to compete for their customers.
In 1980, Malcolm Fraser's office ordered an inquiry into Australia's highly regulated financial system. Fraser and Howard now accuse each other of delaying the process of reform in the setting up of the Campbell inquiry on banking and exchange rates.
The fact that there would be a capital market inquiry was forced through the Monetary Policy Committee of Cabinet. And the Monetary Policy Committee of Cabinet asked for the Treasurer to give us terms of reference within 6 weeks. We got them about 9 months later.
The important thing, of course, was the response when the report came down, and not much doubt as to who dragged their heels then.
Cabinet did finally approve the introduction of some foreign banks. But other reforms, such as the floating of the dollar, would have to wait for the Labor government. John Howard is adamant he did take at least one other submission to Cabinet.
I tried from November 81 until the defeat of the government to have some other things implemented, including a substantial deregulation of interest rates, and he was opposed to that.
No submission of any significance in relation to that report was rejected or delayed by my Cabinet. There's at least one, and I think 2 letters on record saying, why is it taking so long to have submissions written? Why aren't you getting submissions up? The submissions never arrived by the time we had an election.
The economic debate in the Liberal Party began to intersect with leadership tensions. Some who despaired of Fraser's policies even began toying with the idea of Andrew Peacock as an alternative leader. In April 1981, Andrew Peacock resigned from Fraser's cabinet.
He has bypassed the system of government by acting with a manic determination to get his own way, and I find the constant disloyalty and erratic acts of behaviour intolerable and not to be endured.
Andrew's resignation did significant damage to the government. If you look at the polls at that point, we dipped down in the polls, and if it hadn't been for that resignation, the 1983 election might have been quite different.
I wish the whole thing hadn't occurred, because I'll be very frank with you, I don't think I should have resigned from Malcolm Fraser's cabinet. I certainly wasn't interested in challenging Malcolm Fraser at that period. I became interested later on. One of the reasons, ironically, I became interested in is that I kept hearing that I was the likely one.
Later that year, a new car plan was introduced by the Liberals' deputy leader, Phillip Lynch. The economic reformers in the party were dismayed. It didn't go nearly far enough in reducing tariffs. A group of backbenchers led by John Hyde came close to overturning cabinet. It was the final blow for Lynch.
Well, I believe it's time for a younger man to assume the office.
At the same time, Malcolm Fraser called on a challenge against the looming Andrew Peacock.
The purpose of Thursday's meeting must be to face the issue and end the speculation once and for all.
I felt that, in fact, Malcolm Fraser was becoming far too authoritarian, that, in fact, the structures he'd put in place were setting minister against minister and public servant against public servant. The structure was wrong and he was behaving wrongly.
Peacock lost the challenge.
That vote is over now, and as I indicated both privately to the Prime Minister and semi-privately in the sense that it was in the party room, that we have to work together, and he has my support.
At the same party meeting, the reform-minded John Howard would take the deputy leadership.
At the time, I thought the selection of John Howard as deputy leader was a reasonable choice. I had clearly promoted John Howard into a number of positions, including into the acting Treasury portfolio after an election had begun in very difficult circumstances. And he handled those issues with great competence and a considerable degree of skill. And he's a good parliamentary debater. But I didn't realise, perhaps, that there were some other implications of the change. And if I had, for the good of the party, I think it would have been better if Phillip Lynch had stayed.
The implications of the change were that the leader and his deputy were heading in different directions.
Mr Howard went through the annual ritual of addressing the National Press Club on the budget, but today his speech was interrupted briefly by a group of unemployed who entered the club by a side door waving placards.
Malcolm Fraser's instincts were to spend money to ease the burden of recession. He imposed this strategy on a reluctant Howard.
I felt that, having told the community for 6 years that the way to salvation was through restraint and not trying to spend your way out of trouble, it was a bit disingenuous to then say that the way to salvation is to spend your way out of trouble.
Now, if a treasurer feels so put out by a particular budget that he believes he's got no part in it, then presumably he should have taken some sort of action, and if he didn't, that says something about him.
Sometimes the most courageous thing to do, particularly if, for example, you're a deputy leader, is to stay in, knowing full well that if it all falls apart, you'll get the blame. And that turned out, in a sense, to be my fate.
If you do not move immediately, you will be arrested. Is there any reason why you cannot move? Yes. You're under arrest. We consider this World Heritage Area. You're under arrest.
Franklin and Gorton rivers support the only large limestone ecology in the southwest. We should have
By 1982, events throughout the country were beginning to slip beyond Malcolm Fraser's control.
These men are collecting their last pay packets. These men, along with thousands across the country, have been laid off.
The economy was staggering from recession and drought. Unrest reached the Parliament itself when retrenched coal miners confronted the government.
Economic problems have been severe, they've been great, and we ourselves might hold some of the responsibility for this because I think we were too optimistic about what we or the economy working in partnership could perform.
The strain was telling on Malcolm Fraser.
Other countries and reducing.
Plans for an early election in 1982 were thwarted when the Prime Minister was admitted to hospital with serious back problems. Fraser recovered, and early the following year he called a snap election, hoping to go to the polls against Bill Hayden.
The Prime Minister moved early here in Canberra today to bring on the early election.
I recommended to His Excellency that there should be a double dissolution of the Parliament.
In a day of drama, as the Prime Minister was at Government House, the Labor Party was replacing Hayden with Bob Hawke.
I repeat, it gives me no joy to have to do this. I'm sure you'd understand. It's created a great deal of heartburn for me.
Bill Hayden has done a remarkably courageous thing.
Malcolm Fraser went into the campaign without the opportunity to test Hawke as opposition leader in the Parliament.
It's not a decision that really I want to spend much time defending, because since you lost the election, or I lost the election, the timing was clearly wrong. You're not going to call an early election if you think you're going to lose.
I can remember in the final days of the Fraser period, I think we'd come in on a VIP flight to Richmond. I can remember saying to others in the car, look, you know, I never want anything more to do with this business as long as I live. I was disappointed. I thought opportunities had been missed. I thought, you know, politics was winning out in a sense, I suppose. But, you know, we'd made a lot of changes in some areas, but really, compared to what was needed to be done, we'd fallen well short. I wanted to wash my hands of the whole process.
By halfway through the campaign, and certainly with 10 days to go, it was
pretty evident that we weren't going to win. The polling was showing that, and I had a number of talks with him. Now, he said to me, Tony, whatever this shows, I'm going to fight this election up to the line, and you will not notice in me any change in my demeanour in fighting this campaign up until polling day.
To give more power to union leaders of this calibre.
And he stuck to his word. He campaigned as though he didn't have a problem in terms of winning the election, although he knew. And so, consequently, he had given a lot of thought to his future.
First, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Hawke and the Australian Labour Party on winning this election. I want to say that I, from this moment, resign from the leadership of the Liberal Party. I will not contest the leadership of the Liberal Party.
I don't think Fraser should have resigned after the 1983 defeat. Malcolm should have stayed as a caretaker leader of the opposition for a year or two. That would have given the Liberal Party an opportunity of settling down and thinking a bit harder about the medium and the longer term. I certainly would have appreciated him staying, because inevitably all the rubbish that was hurled at the former government, that always gets hurled at just defeated governments, all of it came in my direction. Nobody else was particularly keen to join me.
Whether I stayed on as caretaker leader or not, it would have been better for the party if I had stayed. It really would have. Even if I'd stepped aside from events for 2 or 3 years, by the time 1987 had come around and people had demonstrated, or that Howard and Peacock had demonstrated that they weren't prepared to work with each other, then what would they have done?
I think if Malcolm had stayed on in the Parliament, as time went by, I think he would have found himself back again as leader, and I think that our period in the wilderness would have been a lot shorter.
In his final days, Malcolm Fraser handed the party over to Andrew Peacock and John Howard. And for a man who'd been Prime Minister for more than 7 years, there seemed to be few regrets at his departure.
Why did the party reject Fraserism? Well, Malcolm had been a huge figure, a towering figure, who cast such a huge shadow, and I suppose people wanted to get out from under the shadow.
It created an opportunity for those people concerned with a reformist agenda to get on with the job. And in order to do that effectively, one, I think, had to point to Malcolm Fraser as having been an impediment to that reform process during his period as Prime Minister.
I really believe that the experience after the Fraser government, where he was in effect demonised, has been a very unhappy thing for the Liberal Party. We've got to do better about cherishing our past.
As time passed, the differing verdicts on the Fraser government came to be publicly expressed by Fraser himself and his deputy. It was a rift over the way the Liberal Party views its own history.
Fraser was very generous to me. He promoted me. He lifted me out of the ruck, and I'm publicly very grateful for that. And I returned that by giving him enormous loyalty in the time that I was a member of his government. Naturally, after Fraser went, I had a perfect entitlement to put my own view of the world, and I had a perfect entitlement to acknowledge the areas where we disagreed. I mean, the proposition that I should have spent the years after 1983 defending everything that Malcolm did was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I find that almost offensive.
I can remember issuing a statement about 1971 or maybe early 1972 criticising those Liberals who were trying to disassociate themselves from the legacy of the Menzies years. And I was making a simple point that if you depreciate, you cut off the legs of the party through those years, then what does the party stand for? But I suppose the point is that if there were people in the early 70s who were going to do that with Menzies, who retired in his own time in 1966, a great party hero, They were certainly going to do it to Fraser, who had won 3 elections and then lost one. And sure enough, they did.
And I would like to thank all my colleagues and the Liberal Party right around the country for the support they've given for the last 7 years.
Mr. Horton has just arrived. He's pushing his way through the crowds at the moment, looking very pleased.
There really has been magnificent support in very difficult times. There are many wonderful people who believed in what the government was doing, and I thank them for that.